studios in New York City. This is Charlie Rose.
Robert McNamara is here. He participated in some extraordinary historical moments in the 20th century. He was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force during World War II. He took part in the bombings of Japan in 1945. He served as Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. He played a major role in the Cuban Missile Crisis and was instrumental in the planning and execution of the Vietnam War. He is now the subject of a new documentary called The Fog of War. Its creator and director, Errol Morris, is an accomplished filmmaker. I'm pleased to have both of them at this table this evening. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Delighted to be here.
Thanks for inviting both of us.
My pleasure. How did this originate with you? I mean, what gave you the idea to come to Robert McNamara?
Of course, it's a question that's been asked me many times.
Still a good question.
I'll be interested.
Still a good question, don't you think?
Reading in retrospect.
Is there a do it?
In retrospect, came out in 1995. I read it. I found it to be immensely interesting. I found it to be also very different than the book that was described in the many reviews and editorials which came out at the same time as its release.
The book was different than the reviews?
The book, to me, was very different than the reviews.
How so?
The book was described as a confession or as a mea culpa. A lot of reviewers said, for example, Robert McNamara is trying to apologize, and we don't accept his apology.
Or it didn't go far enough.
Or perhaps it didn't go far enough. What was interesting to me is that the book was not an apology, but an attempt to understand and explain himself and his role in history. I believe you could also, forgive me for saying so, call it an anguished attempt to try to understand the past. I found it a very powerful, interesting, and moving book. So probably from that point on, then there were two books which followed, Argument Without End and Wilson's Ghost. And it was shortly after the publication of Wilson's Ghost that I contacted Mr. McNamara for the first time and asked him to come to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, for an interview.
Did you feel, when you went up there, beyond the opportunity to talk about the threat of a nuclear catastrophe, did you feel like that you had been, to your own satisfaction, had not explained Robert McNamara, either in your book or in other places?
No, I'm not interested in explaining Robert McNamara. I'm interested in deriving lessons. I'm 87 years old. I've served in all kinds of I've served as an administrator basically for 65 years.
Sure, Ford Motor Company, the Pentagon, and World Bank.
And the military.
And the military.
And since then in nonprofits and domestic and foreign corporate boards of directors. And I draw some lessons from that relating to Enron, by the way. But in any event, I've drawn lessons from this, and I wanted to have an opportunity to put forward my lessons. Some of them are applicable today, not just to nuclear weapons.
All right, well, let's talk about that, and we'll come back to some of the other things that are in here and show some clips from the movie. What lessons are applicable to today, especially now that some comparisons are being made between Iraq and Vietnam?
Well, I don't want to, by stating lessons, I don't want to suggest that these should be applied to the Iraq situation. If you think so, do it. But these are lessons that apply in general to security.
All right.
The first lesson is empathize with your opponent. Now, I don't use the word empathy as synonymous with sympathy, not at all. I use the word empathy as understand your opponent. We did not understand the North Vietnamese. They didn't understand us. With one exception, we really didn't understand Khrushchev. The one exception was Llewellyn Thompson.
Yeah, Tommy Thompson, who had been ambassador to the
critical moment, in a sense, prevented a nuclear war.
He said to President Kennedy,
he said to Mr. Kennedy,
Khrushchev,
you're wrong, President Kennedy. President Kennedy, we had this little company. We had a soft message from Khrushchev that we could accept. We had a tough message that we couldn't accept. The tough message had been publicized before we received it. The soft message was sent in secret. We wanted to...
But the soft message came before the tough message.
Well, it's a little uncertain. But you're right, it did, but it's not clear it was... But in any event, which message to respond to? Tommy said, you got to respond. I mean, the majority of Kennedy's advisors said, you got to respond to the tough message. Tommy said,
including your friend General LeMay.
Yeah, but Tommy said, Mr. President, respond to the soft message. The President said, that's what's wrong with you, Tommy. You don't understand politics. No political leader can put out a tough message and in the public and, in a sense, accept a lesser deal than that. He couldn't survive. Tommy said, Mr. President, I know that man. I've lived with him. I knew his wife, Jane. He and Jane, his wife, had actually lived with Khrushchev, vacations and otherwise. He said, I believe he will accept your acceptance of the soft message. Kennedy said, well, it's a risk, but I'll do it. Khrushchev did. That prevented a nuclear war.
Because he believed, Thompson believed Khrushchev was looking for a way out.
That's right. And he knew what Kennedy could offer, and he thought Thompson would.
Suppose we had empathized with the North Vietnamese, what might we have done?
Well, they didn't emphasize with us, let me say that.
Well, we can't worry about that, and we are responsible for what we can do.
But if they don't emphasize with us, it's hard for one party only to emphasize. Anyhow, what we could have done, the second lesson from my life is, for God's sakes, communicate with your opponent. And that's true in business, and it's true in non-governmentals, and it's sure as hell true in security relationships. We did not have any contact, direct contact, between President Johnson and Ho Chi Minh during the entire period. We came closest in a deal that, in a sense, I worked on with Henry Kissinger, who was then a professor at Harvard. We came damn close to getting negotiated.
It would have been possible.
It would have been possible.
For the two of them to talk.
That's right. Well, or to have a high-ranking emissary, say April Harriman or somebody like that.
Go over there.
Right. And the New York Times had an article that said that Hussein was trying to make a deal with us before war started.
And a Lebanese businessman went to see Richard Pearl in London.
Yeah, but my God, assuming for the moment Hussein
was very disturbing article.
It was a disturbing
Well, it was
article.
disturbing.
And the CIA rejected it,
well,
according to the New York Times, right?
Yes.
Well, I was going to say, if that was Hussein's idea, and I'm not all sure it was, but if it was, he chose a damn poor way of communicating. You don't do it through third-level individuals who can be disregarded.
Okay, but the main thing is to communicate with the enemies and find out.
That's right. Find out what their requirements are and what yours are, and see if you can bring them together.
One of the things for me, having made this movie, that is so disturbing is ostensibly Robert McNamara is talking about events that occurred 40, 50, 60 years ago. This was not intentional, but it became more and more obvious as we worked on the film. Even though he's talking about history, he could just as easily be talking about events that occurred 4, 5, 6 days ago, which gives me a funny feeling.
What kind of feeling?
The question, are we doomed? I would call it a feeling of despair, if you like. Are we doomed to repeating endlessly the mistakes that we've made in the past? Can we do things differently? His earliest memory, I should allow him to describe it rather than myself, but it's of World War I, Armistice Day, 1918. Wilson's war to end all wars. If you like, a preventative war.
And the people thought we'd achieved that objective. How wrong they were. We human beings killed 160 million other human beings after the time President Wilson thought would want a war to end all wars. We killed them in conflict within nations and across borders in the 20th century. Is that what we want for the 21st? It's not what I want. And my books and my statements, and to some degree this film, are directed toward trying to move toward that objective, avoiding 160 million fatalities in the 21st century.
Do you think that what comes out of the fog of war is a picture of Robert McNamara that people have not seen before, and if so, in what way?
I think.
What do you believe you've captured here?
I think that we have uncovered new stories in the course of making the film. I like to think that everything I do has an investigative element. But certainly in the course of making The Fog of War, we unearthed a lot of interesting material about the firebombing of Japan.
Stop right there. Roll tape. McNamara talks about the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945 and General Curtis LeMay. Here it is.
I participated in the interrogation of the B-29 bomber crews that came back that night. A room full of crewmen and intelligence interrogators. The captain got up, young captain, and said, "God damn it, I'd like to know who the son of a bitch was that took this magnificent airplane designed to bomb from 23,000 feet, and he took it down to 5,000 feet, and I lost my wingman."
So what mistake did we make?
In that situation, I don't want to say we made any mistake, but I want to say that I think the human race should establish some rules of war, because we killed 83,000 civilians in that one raid. And we did it because we feared, the presidents feared and the chiefs feared, we were going to have to send American boys across the beaches of Tokyo to take Japan. My friends had been killed in the island wars in the Pacific. The presidents knew that.
Guadalcanal and everywhere else.
Guadalcanal, with the Iwo Jima and the Marianas and so on. So I understood what was being done, and there was a reason for it. But couldn't we have done it with less human killing? We leveled 69 cities. I've forgotten how many in total we killed, something like 900,000. Now, shouldn't there be some proportionality? Shouldn't the human race set up a juridical...
Okay, but was the same thing true about the bombings in Vietnam? Could we have done it without?
Yes, I think we could have.
But were you that wise then, or is this some conclusion you come to later about proportionality?
It wasn't clear, and let me just say...
It wasn't clear to you.
No, it wasn't clear to me, and today it isn't clear. I think it's clear to me. It's not clear to much of your audience. It's not clear to the human race. We, the human race, have not established any judicial framework within which war and crimes against humanity can be carried out. We have set up a court, the International Court for Crimes Against Humanity. Our country is one of the few major countries that have not supported that. I know why. They're concerned that our people will be brought to the fore by Gaddafi or somebody. And there's reason to fear that. But there are many safeguards in the international court procedures, and we can negotiate more. We ought to accept the objective of trying to set some acceptable standards for combat that will reduce casualties.
You don't want to second-guess Rumsfeld.
Absolutely not.
Jonathan Alder.
I want to stop you 1 second and say, 71, you won't believe this, but 71 reporters, TV, radio, magazine, newspaper, from all over the world, Australia, Brazil, Western Europe, have asked me to comment on Iraq. I haven't responded to one. The reason is, I think it is irresponsible for an ex-Secretary of Defense to comment in any way on the actions of a president who's deeply involved in war with hundreds of thousands of our citizens at risk, and he is carrying out very delicate negotiation with UN and other countries. I haven't said a word, and I'm not going to.
I'm not sure.
See, this is where we do disagree. Well, we disagree in the sense that...
What do you disagree about?
I think that it's very important for Robert McNamara to speak out about these issues.
I do too.
I know that he has very strong feelings. I know he said things to me in private.
I'll kill you if you repeat them.
And in fact, I won't repeat them out of respect for him and our relationship. But I know that he has spent a large fraction of a life in public service. And he has learned a lot of things from that life. And it's important that he brings that knowledge to bear.
But he is not doing it in total.
Well,
you know he's not, Errol. Come on.
Now, wait a second.
You just said that.
I think that he could be more outspoken.
He specifically thinks I should comment on the Iraq situation. In the book, In Retrospect,
right,
and in the other two books,
right,
I drew lessons. And those lessons can be applied to Iraq. Let people read the books and apply the lessons. I'm not going to criticize my president when he's in a war.
But let me just suggest to you that one of the important things that you underlined, other than empathy and other than communication, is that we need to have public debate about the essential issue.
Total agreement.
You make that point time after time.
We didn't have adequate debate on Vietnam.
And you're not willing to participate in the debate because of some silly rule you have.
We haven't a public debate.
Well, you can initiate it.
Nobody asked me to participate in a debate.
lots of people would ask. You just told me that every reporter that's ever come to you has asked you to participate in a debate.
They didn't ask me to participate in a debate. They wanted a one-sided comment. I'm not going to
Fair enough. Suppose I put together here a group of people, including former secretaries of state and secretaries of defense, to talk about where America goes, Iraq, and later. You're not going to participate in that? You're not going to tell us what you think, if in fact it might be important to the direction and decisions that the country takes?
Well, let me say...
The debate, not so much what happens here.
Let me say that I think for senior officials to debate in the midst of a war is the wrong time. Our people are at risk. The debate may encourage the enemy.
Maybe it's even more critical that we debate during war.
That, but just think this through. It may encourage the enemy. Look what happened a few days ago. Or
they always say that. That's what they said in Vietnam, and you know that.
All right, but it's true. Look what happened a few days ago when that Israeli general criticized Israeli policies. That certainly encouraged the Palestinians. Is that what we want?
Encourage Palestinians to do what?
To be tougher, to think that there's weakness in the Israelis.
Take, for example,
wait a minute. Do you think that he should not have said that? Should not have in an interview with those three Israeli journalists, should not have raised questions for consideration? I mean,
he didn't raise them for consideration. He said our policies are wrong. We should change.
He spoke to the issue of how they. Yes, he did. But they spoke to the issue of how they were treating the Palestinians, and as to whether it was counterproductive and whether they were creating more problems. Listen. Donald Rumsfeld, in his famous memo, which came leaked out of the Pentagon, raised these very same questions. Did he not?
Well,
the Secretary of Defense raised the question.
In a different way. The implication of the Israeli general's comments, as I read them, was that he believed the Israelis should change such policies, and in a sense, the Palestinians should expect changes.
I think I would argue, whatever the decision ought to be made by the Israelis, they should make the decision.
Yes,
He's an Israeli.
I agree.
He raised the question as to what was in the best interest of his country.
I agree.
You have said that debate is in the best interest of decision-making.
But it depends on when the debate takes place.
Well, it shouldn't just necessarily be in the... suppose Tommy Thompson hadn't been there.
Well,
the decision in that cabinet room would have been
a closed debate.
But it would have been better. John Kennedy said that if, in fact, newspapers had printed some things, that he might not have made some mistakes that he made. Yeah. You know that.
Take, for example, one of the lessons.
Of course you know that.
There's one of the lessons in the movie.
Are we making any insight here, any inroads here?
No.
You still think that it's not important to have a debate?
I think it's important to have a debate.
It's not important for a former Secretary of Defense who hasn't been Secretary of Defense since the 60s.
That's right.
Since the 60s, more than 25 years ago, to speak out and say, this is what I've learned, and this is what the judgment at 85 I have about public events.
There's several points. The first point is that I don't have the information the President has and the Secretary of Defense has.
Well, maybe he doesn't have the information you have in a different way.
We don't have the judgment and experience. But in any event, I am not going to participate.
But see, I mean,
one does not have to be omniscient to speak out.
Exactly.
Let me give one example from the movie, and it's certainly one of Robert McNamara's fundamental lessons. It's a lesson about multilateralism.
Yeah.
He says in the course of the movie that we didn't listen to any of our allies. If we had listened to our allies in the course of Vietnam, we wouldn't have been there. It's a direct quote. We wouldn't have been there. Now, this is actually a question for you. Do you see any parallels in the current situation?
I'm not going to answer that question.
Well, there you go.
All right, but let me say, because this would be a comment on the judgments.
It's harmless.
It is
harmless. To say that we should listen to our allies or not.
Harmless. Well, let me just say this.
What damage is that going to do if Robert McNamara says that I think we'd be better off if we listened to our allies?
Well, I had an interview with a French reporter today, a very, very bright young lady. And in the course of conversation, she said, well, how do you look at our two nations today? I said, with sadness, almost despair.
Sure.
We were allies for 200 years, and we've drawn apart over this issue of Iraq. We've just got to get back together again. And I see some moves in that direction, but they ought to be further and faster.
Well, what move do you see in that direction? The vote of the UN, or the fact that they
I say,
didn't veto?
Let me say I see a movement away from childish
Okay.
comments
No,
about each
let
other.
me just make this point.
Here's another example.
Okay.
Anti-ballistic missiles. We're sitting with a man here who has opposed anti-ballistic missile systems for almost as long as they have been in existence.
Since the mid-'60s.
And we have a current situation where it seems to me, not speaking from a position of omniscience, but from what I read in the papers, that the arms race has been restarted. Robert McNamara's point is a very simple point. What is an anti-missile missile? It's a missile.
Right.
And you build a more powerful, bigger anti-missile missile, you get bigger missiles in response. And it adds up to the same damn thing in the end, an arms
I agree.
race.
That's been my argument. But that's not the major problem today.
What's the major problem?
The major problem,
in terms of proliferation?
That's right. The major problem today is proliferation. And the major problem today is that that we, in a sense, don't empathize with some of these countries. They have reasons to fear their neighbors. And we say to hell with it. Your conventional force is less than your neighbors. We're not going to allow you to move to nuclear weapons. And thank God we say that. But there has to be some acceptance that they have a fear. In certain of these instances, we have to provide security guarantees.
I want to talk about this too. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we have spoken about, but I want to at least show another clip to give an audience at home. This is a very interesting movie, and Errol deserves credit, and you deserve credit. And here is another clip from the film. Take a look.
I want to say, and this is very important, at the end, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. We came that close to nuclear war at the end. Rational individuals. Kennedy was rational. Khrushchev was rational. Castro was rational. Rational individuals came that close to total destruction of their societies.
It scares you, doesn't it?
It does. It should scare you. It should scare you. I mean to scare you. I don't want to say scare you, but I mean to
Well,
to alert.
That luck saved us from
I mean to
nuclear.
alert the human race. Let me just take 30 seconds because he left out an important part. That's it. Yeah. At 4 p.m. on Saturday, the critical moment, Saturday, October 27, 1963, that was the critical moment. The president had his Security Council there, the chiefs, secretaries of state and defense and national security advisor and the director of CIA. We argued all day long about what to do. We weren't sure. We hadn't been able to get the damn missiles out. We had to get them out. We had photographs of the missiles on the soil of Cuba. The CIA said, we don't think the warheads are there yet. We think the first batch of 20 warheads are coming on a ship named the Poltava. They'll be in there in 2 or 3 days. We'd had a contingency plan of attack developed. The first day's airstrike was planned at 1,080 sorties, larger than any day in Kosovo. We had 180,000 troops mobilized in southeast U.S. ports. We had the shipping there. We were ready to go. At 4 p.m., the chief said, Mr. President, we recommend unanimously that you undertake this attack within 2 days. It wasn't until 29 years later, in January 1992, that we learned that at that moment, the Soviets had about 170 nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba.
Already there, not
already
on the ship
there.
on there.
Roughly 90 tactical warheads to be used against an invasion war, and roughly 80 to be used in the missiles to attack 90 million Americans. That's how you make mistakes. We had the wrong...
Or you have bad intelligence.
We had, well, but we had a damn good intelligence outfit. I had tremendous admiration for CIA.
Were they wrong about the number of nuclear warheads in Cuba?
You're damn right. But can intelligence people be perfect? No. You've got to understand that.
Perfect is not the difference between saying that there are none on the island and having 92.
Well, the point I want to make is there are serious limits that'll never be overcome to the intelligence you will have and have to depend on in relation to these critical decisions, and you better be damn careful. And fortunately, we lucked out, because at that moment, Khrushchev saw, he literally saw these 180,000 troops, and he feared an invasion. And when Kennedy sent that answer to, I'm going to call it the soft message, and basically accepted the deal, Khrushchev so feared that the war would start before he could tell Kennedy, he accepted Kennedy's acceptance, that he sent an assistant down to the public radio transmitter in Moscow. And he said, hold that transmitter open, I have a message. It took normally 6 hours to communicate a message from Khrushchev to Kennedy. You had to write it and translate it and put it in code and send it and then decode it and send it to the White House. He was going to get it done in a sense, 6 minutes. And we learned of his acceptance of Kennedy's proposal, the action that delayed, that prevented nuclear war. We learned it over the public radio transmitter.
I want to ask this question, which is off the beaten path. Compare Johnson and Kennedy. You sat with them, served them.
Oh, you know, I can't do that in 2 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever.
Well, did you get into this, or?
No, not really.
Well, yes, we did.
Well,
not to contradict anybody.
I had.
Well, come on, what?
No, I didn't really compare them. I talked about each. I had, maybe the point to make is about Johnson, because ultimately I left. I had tremendous respect and affection for Johnson. I think he had respect and affection for me. At the end, we disagreed totally, and something had to give, and I was out. Right. And I said to my friend Kay Graham, a former publisher of the Washington Post, you know, Kay, to this day, this was, I don't know when, 5, 7 years ago before she died, I said, to this day, Kay, I don't know whether I quit or was fired. He said, McNamara, you're out of your mind. Of course you were fired. Now, the reason I said I didn't know I was fired, because I had this tremendous respect and affection for Johnson. And I wanted to stay as long as I could be of help. But anyhow, I left. And that was the proper thing, because he and I were in total disagreement.
A little bit of history coming out of this. Go ahead.
I'm reminded in this conversation of how difficult you are to interview.
I mean, it reminds me, too, because I've been here before.
Because one thing is that you have this implacable sense of rectitude. There are things that are proper to speak about and things which are improper to speak about.
I do, and I feel it very strongly.
I know this.
And we can respect
There's
you for that, but.
no doubt about it. I found out in the course of making the movie, I hope I'm not revealing too much here, the best way to get McNamara to talk about things is never to urge him to talk about it. If you wait long enough and you are patient long enough,
23 hours of interview.
23 hours, whatever, you will hear what you want to hear.
Did you hear what you wanted to hear?
In this sense, I wanted to be surprised. I wanted to hear the unexpected. I wanted to hear things that I hadn't heard before. When I first started this project, I thought, what can I accomplish here? Here is a man who's been interviewed literally thousands and thousands of times. What do I expect to hear that hasn't been heard before, and probably heard before many, many times over? You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there are many surprising and interesting things in the movie. And I have to say that I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity. And I think that there are things to be learned from the movie and from Robert McNamara himself. Very important things.
Like?
He, for a certain generation, has often been described as an efficiency expert, a number cruncher. Harry Reasoner describes him in one documentary from the 60s as an IBM machine with legs. I found a very different man, a man who thinks often about ethical, about moral questions. If you like, it becomes a more disturbing story, because it's not a story about a bad man who did bad things. It's a story about a man who in many, many ways was a good man who did bad things. I'm a person who demonstrated against the Vietnam War as a young student at the University of Wisconsin and at Princeton. And I haven't changed my views about the war at all. I feel now about the war as I did then. But I respect Robert McNamara's attempt to go back into his life, to go back into history, and to re-examine it again and again and again. Without his desire to do that, this movie would have been impossible. And I believe that there's a lot to be learned from his enterprise.
Do you think Robert McNamara is at peace with himself?
No.
What a human being is. I hope they're not.
If you're not, then what are you not at peace about?
Well, I
think it's one of his virtues.
I'm not at peace
Yes.
because I haven't been able to convince other people, or at least enough other people, of the soundness of some of my major thoughts that I think are in their interest and in the interest of the human race.
Well, give me the most important of those.
Well, the most
major
important
thoughts.
one is the one that Strzok and Blair and Schroeder referred to as the greatest threat to security in the 21st century, the risk of nuclear war. That's the most important. And that is not quite accepted. It should be. And I'm intent on trying to increase its acceptance.
Well, I think we accept that, but we don't necessarily do.
Well, I don't
let me
think
finish.
if
We accept it, but we don't do enough to.
If we accept it, we're
not doing enough to.
We're not
meet the
applying that.
the fear of
Accept
it.
it. We're applying the knowledge.
We have to have this part of this conversation. You expect him to say what? You did bad things, he said. What did you mean?
The war in Vietnam,
What
for
did he
me,
do?
is a very bad thing.
Well, he didn't do the war in Vietnam. I mean, he was the.
He was certainly part of the war effort. He was the Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy and Johnson
He
administrations.
could have resigned on principle.
He could have resigned on principle. There are many, many, many questions about the 60s, what happened in the war, the tragedy, the true tragedy, not only that we started the war, but even after he left the Johnson administration in 1968, the war continued until 1975 with millions of Vietnamese dying and tens of thousands of Americans.
Yeah, what you've heard this before on this program, even that you know the central thing that happened about that was that people felt like that even after you acknowledged that you would realize certain things about the war, you didn't speak out even then.
Well, that, again, for an ex-Secretary of Defense to speak out against a war that is...
But Americans were dying.
But more Americans... Well, in the first place, I might have been wrong because almost all my associates believed I was wrong. But assuming I was correct, and I think with hindsight I was, by speaking out publicly in the midst of a war, more Americans could die. It could give aid. It would have given aid and comfort to the enemy. That's absurd to suggest.
Well, did you go in and I mean, okay?
Well, I sure as hell went in and spoke
to Johnson.
To Johnson in writing and orally, and that's all on the record.
Right.
That's why we broke.
And you now say the Vietnam War was wrong, of course.
Well,
and you,
no, that's not.
You don't say that?
That's not quite what I say.
What does he say?
Well, let
What
me.
does he say?
Well,
this
I
is
should
not
allow-
well understood. Let me just make this point, and I don't want to appear to be self-serving, so I brought with me a thing I'm going to read. This is
Fair enough.
a little note from the, I think it was the New York Times. Yes, the New York Times, February 1st of this year, and it says it refers to a book and a man named Keegan, and Keegan wrote a book, and he says, quote, "The Vietnam War was not the brainchild of 3 or 4 people. It was a product of a whole way of thinking about the world. It was, for better or worse, the logical consequence of the policy of containment, which is the policy we followed for 50 years, set out by George Kennan. And the breadth and depth of support for American policy in Vietnam, certainly in the elite intellectual class, including Errol, was enormous. Let's not suggest that there was somehow just the Bundys or Walt Rostows. This was national consensus. This war was part of the Cold War. It was a logical derivative of the Cold War. Now, I think we were wrong in many of our judgments, but at the time, when you recognize how close we'd come to war with the Soviets 3 times in my 7 years as secretary, in September of '61, in October of '62, and in June of '67, we came close to war with the Soviets. This Vietnam was part of that. Today, that isn't recognized. It should be.
You expected something. You wanted him to confront what with respect to Vietnam, Earl?
there are so many questions, among them certainly Mr. McNamara's silence after he left the Johnson administration. What's really interesting...
Let me interrupt just one moment. I wasn't silent when I wrote that book in retrospect.
But this was much later.
I laid out the decision-making process, the decisions that were wrong, and the lessons that should be learned from it.
Yes.
Nobody else has done anything like that, not only in Vietnam, but other situations are comparable. But that's what should be expected of every leader.
And I think it's an extraordinary and interesting book. One of its kind in many, many ways.
But?
It's not that there's some hidden but here that hasn't been addressed. There are going to be many, many unsolved mysteries about Vietnam, about Robert McNamara.
About the human race killing people. They're unsolved.
Unsolved questions, issues, if you like, about evil, about the problem of evil, of where it comes from.
Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the greatest theologians, said, how much evil should be done to achieve good? That's a basic problem.
I think we have this very simplistic idea that evil is the product of evil people, that they're a host of Iagos in the wings, rubbing their hands together, conniving, calculating, plotting. And then the solution is just, well, let's find out where they are and let's go get them. Let's kill them. Let's lock them up. And there you have it, a solution to the problem of evil. But what if evil is much harder to identify? What if we're all capable of it?
And what if at times it's necessary to do good? That was Niebuhr's point.
Yes. I'm reminded, and I have been reminded again and again in the course of making the movie, how complex these decisions were that this man faced. This is not to excuse what he did or to apologize for him. That's not my role, nor would I want to do so. I felt part, and I still feel part of this enterprise of trying to examine history and a man's role in it. This is a very odd movie because you see movies about history, you'll see 5, 6, 7, 8 or more characters arguing with each other. This movie contains only one individual, Robert McNamara. Sometimes I see this shadow figure. Sometimes I see the 85-year-old McNamara arguing with the 45-year-old McNamara. And we can ask ourselves, is it the same man? Or are these different men? Or in what way are they the same? Or in what way are they different? One thing, though, I do know for sure is that the enterprise of trying to figure out who we are and why we do what we do is a very deep and important enterprise. And for better, for worse, this man is engaged in it.
That's what I've been devoting myself to for 35 years. And I make no apologies for it. It is an essential step toward advancing the human race.
Will I ever understand why he won't speak out against the current administration? I probably won't.
No, I don't think you will.
Loyalty?
No, it's not loyalty. It's
a sense of what is proper and improper.
It's a sense of what's in the interest of the American people today, when Americans are dying in Iraq. That's not the time for an ex-Secretary of Defense to, as you
What do you think of the
out.
idea that all that is required for evil to triumph
Is what?
is for good men in this case not to speak up?
Well, I have spoken out in retrospect. There are
But
lessons
that's not
in
about
there.
current situations. Again, it's not that you're going to come down on one side or the other.
Read the
It is
book
to
and
speak out.
Read the book and you decide whether it applies to the current situation.
But you are the figure. You are the person. You can't say, well, read the book and you can decide. I mean, anyway, I want to move beyond that, but because
I think
clearly,
we're running out.
Well,
We're running out of
maybe
time.
I'll be okay though, and I can make that choice. What are you in this search to explain, to understand, to come to terms with? How far are you on that? I mean, have you reached where you wanted to be in terms of...
Let me say, I'm 87 years old and I'm running out of time.
Well, okay, but
So
then, nevertheless...
therefore, I'm sort of accelerating the process.
Right.
In a sense, that's why I did the film. That will get
was
to-
this a kind of catharsis for you?
No, not catharsis. No,
Well, then
no.
what?
Well, it was a chance
To reach your
a chance to reach a large audience with ideas that are very controversial, and to stimulate their think and debate.
Yeah. I mean, it ought to be said in Secretary McNamara's, President McNamara, if you think about the World Bank and Ford Motor Company, it ought to be said, I guess, is that we can, in the end, no one ought to expect someone to say something they're not prepared to say. You know, we can hope for debate, and we can believe it's necessary, and we can believe it's important, and we can believe that certain people bring an important weight, but we can't...
Well, in this case, you ought to believe that I've brought important subjects to the surface
in
that
this
have
film,
not been fully debated. That have not been fully debated.
Yeah. And there's much to be said, especially in today's circumstances, about communication,
Absolutely.
about needing your allies,
Absolutely.
about empathy. What else should I put on that
Communicating
table?
with the American people. Very important.
See, he's saying, I'm not going to say things, not with respect to Iraq, but even with respect, I'm not sure that he said everything that he feels about even the Vietnam experience.
I have.
So
That book-
if there's in other words, you're saying to us with respect to Vietnam, if it's not in retrospect, this book,
It's not in my mind.
it's not in your mind and your
That's
heart.
correct.
That's
That's
right.
correct.
You know,
That's correct.
you know.
I tried to put in the book my mind and my heart.
Yeah. It is fair to say you anguished over that
I sure as
because
hell
of
did.
what it did
I
to the
anguished
country
over-
and because of what it did
I anguished
to
over it,
families and what it did to sons and daughters of
No,
America
I anguished over it
and Vietnamese.
not because I was concerned about stating the truth. I anguished over it because I wasn't sure what the truth was, then or even today,
Today?
about some of the actions in there. Well, let me
Well,
give you.
what aren't you sure about?
Let me give you one. The Johnson administration, particularly President Johnson, has been severely criticized for not being more open with the public, more candid with the public. And it is true that I and George Bundy and some others, Bill Bundy, put together a proposal for Johnson to make to the public when he was moving forward to get further into the war in Vietnam, particularly in the summer of, I think it was 1965. John Gardner, who was another cabinet officer, supported it. Doug Cater, who was, I'll call it the intellectual in the White House, supported it. Johnson didn't accept it. Now, why didn't he? Was he wrong? That's hard to say. Today, the public understands there were demonstrations from the left, great pressure. Johnson didn't appear to take account of it or yield to it. What the public doesn't understand is he was more concerned about the pressure from the right. He was being severely criticized for not going in for not invading North Vietnam, for not bombing North Vietnam, for not bombing the Chinese supply lines, and for not even using nuclear weapons, all of which could have led to war with China and Russia. He was determined to avoid it. He did. I was determined to avoid it. His methods, I think, in retrospect, could be criticized.
This is from Tom Friedman, New York Times, October 13th. It's no Vietnam. There is this notion being peddled by Europeans, the Arab press, and the anti-war left that Iraq is just Arabic for Vietnam, and we should expect these kinds of attacks from Iraqis wanting to liberate their country from the U.S. occupation. These attackers are the Iraqi Viet Cong. Hogwash, says Mr. Friedman, the people who mounted the attacks on the Red Cross are not the Iraqi Viet Cong. They are the Iraqi Khmer Rouge, a murderous band of Saddam loyalists and al-Qaeda nihilists who are not killing us so Iraqis can rule themselves. They're killing us so they can rule Iraqis. Does that ring true?
tremendous fan of Tom Friedman. I read that article. It was a recent column.
Right.
in the
October
Times.
30th.
Yes, exactly. I read that. I thought it made sense. I generally agreed with it.
Have you said, I mean, he asked me, do I want you to say things that I haven't heard you said? No. I mean, I want him to speak up. I want him to I would like to feel like that you were participating fully in the debate, because I believe, and it's fair to say, I don't think that you would say at this table or any other table, I think that you're not speaking up because, if you say you're not speaking up because you think it might give encouragement to the enemy, or you think that it's not appropriate for a former Secretary of Defense to speak up at a time of hostilities, telling the president what he thinks, for better or worse, then I can accept that. I'm not going to say that you're using that to hide behind it.
That's what I believe. I'm not using to hide behind it. And moreover, we've talked about that book in retrospect. Right. We haven't talked about Wilson's Ghost.
Right.
The paper edition of Wilson's Ghost was published 3 months ago. It's up to date. And there I speak up.
You quoted the Thomas Friedman editorial. Of course, even more recently, the New York Times ran a series of articles about how there were attempts at peace negotiations at the last minute.
With respect to Iraq.
With respect to Iraq. One question that kept popping into my mind in the course of editing the movie is this question. What do you do if you serve a bellicose president who wants to go to war? There are two very powerful quotes.
Let me interrupt just one moment. That was not a description of Johnson. I hope you didn't mean it that way.
Well, wait a second. There are two very powerful taped conversations by presidents. A taped conversation by President Kennedy and a taped conversation by President Johnson. Both of these conversations with Robert McNamara. McNamara is speaking to Kennedy, and he's saying, we need a way to get out of Vietnam, and this is a way of doing it.
That was 1963.
He was saying pull all the advisors out.
Pull the advisors out. Set a timetable to pull the advisors out. In the common parlance of today, we need an exit strategy.
Right.
We need to set a date. We need to get out of there. Kennedy is killed. We hear Johnson on the phone chastising his Secretary of Defense, saying that he sat silent
in that meeting
while you and the president discussed pulling the advisors out. I did not agree. How the hell does McNamara think he's going to win a war by pulling out advisors? Now, I'm not saying that I understand the context of either of these conversations completely, but one thing is clear to me is something very decisive has changed. Among them, a president's attitude towards war and his willingness to commit the country to war to achieve a given end. In this case, is Johnson willing to take the country to war to avoid the quote-unquote loss of Vietnam to communism? And I believe that the question from very, very early on, and I know you may correct me, but I believe that the answer is yes.
I don't want to comment further on this now. At one point in the...
Why not?
Because it takes an hour.
You keep saying that.
Look, I'm worried about this program.
I own this time.
I know it, but you own the time. But I'm worried about the program. We have discussed...
What program?
This program.
Oh.
We have discussed some very, very important issues now, and we've been doing it for an hour and 20 minutes, and you're not going to have an hour and 20 minutes for this program.
We've been doing it, by the way, we've done it 57 minutes, and it's 53 hours. Let me sum it up. Say what you want to say.
Let me just say one thing. it's a very complex discussion we've had. For God's sakes, please, please include it almost in its entirety.
Well, I've done 57 minutes, and I've got 53 minutes of airtime. That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. Okay.
All right. Now I want to read finally two things. Sidney Schanberg said this. It also must be said that basically McNamara's detractors would like to say that instead of shedding tears now about the victims of war and engaging in legalisms, he could have saved a lot of lives when he was running the Pentagon for Kennedy and Johnson by going public with his knowledge that the Vietnam War was a lost cause and that Johnson had admitted this in private. That's Schanberg saying that. But it must also be said, Schanberg says, that it is McNamara alone among the many planners of the war who has come forward to say he was wrong. Henry Kissinger, in all of his revisions, books, and speeches, never admitted to a single regret or mistake. True. McNamara's admissions may be incomplete, but they are nonetheless a contribution to history. And the
I hope they are.
And the act must have taken a certain kind of courage, for he knew that by coming forward at all, he was offering himself up for the slaughter. That's Mr. Schanberg. Finally, Stephen Holden, about your movie. If there's one movie that ought to be studied by military and civilian leaders around the world at this treacherous historical moment, it is The Fog of War. Errol Morris' sober, beautifully edited documentary of the former United States Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. Mr. McNamara, who was 85 when the interviews that made up the bulk of the film were conducted 2 years ago, served under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson from 61 to 68. He's been widely vilified as a major architect of the Vietnam War, which cost more than 58,000 American lives, and according to Mr. McNamara, the lives of 3.4 million Americans.
Vietnamese.
I'm sorry, Vietnamese, right. Near the end of the film, when pressed about whether he feels guilty about Vietnam, he dances nimbly away from the question. None of the documentary's lessons can be described as reassuring.
Now, I hope you won't include that, because you'd have to say why I danced away from it.
Why did you?
Well, because to explain my feelings about my position in Vietnam requires at least a half an hour.
Well, but you had all the more than 8.
No, but that question wasn't raised until literally the 25th hour. It was in a car in Washington, and I didn't really understand it was being recorded. That question requires a half an hour to answer.
All right. We've had an hour. Thank you, sir.
But I hope this
you.
is off the record.
No, it's not. It's on the record, so
Okay.
say what you want to say.
All I want to say is, you know, this conversation deals with some fundamentals in my life and some fundamental views and judgments and principles that I have followed. And if it's edited, the full impact of what I have said and tried to say will be lost.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
Thank you.
I wouldn't have come if I didn't think you would.
Nice to see you. Thank you, Earl.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you for joining us for this hour. We'll see you next time.